Before we begin tonight's gentle journey through history, I would love for you to subscribe to the channel if you are enjoying these peaceful bedtime stories, and perhaps give this video a gentle like if it helps you drift into restful sleep. I would also love to hear from you in the comments below. Please share where you are watching from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. There is something so beautifully connecting about knowing we are all here together, sharing these quiet moments across different places and time zones, all seeking the same peaceful rest. Now let yourself settle deeply into this moment, wherever you find yourself tonight. Feel the soft weight of your blankets as they embrace your body. Notice how your pillow cradles your head just perfectly, and allow your breathing to slow and deepen naturally. Imagine you are in a cozy ship's cabin, gently rocking with the rhythm of calm ocean waves, with the soft glow of lantern light dancing across weathered wooden walls, and the distant sound of gentle sea breezes whispering through the rigging above. Let all the worries and thoughts of your day drift away like morning mist over the water as we prepare to embark on a peaceful journey through time. Our story tonight begins in the golden age of sail, when brave explorers set forth across vast and mysterious oceans in search of new lands, precious spices, and untold riches. Picture yourself standing on the wooden docks of a bustling port city in the year 1650, where the salty sea air mingles with the scents of exotic goods from distant shores. The harbor stretches before you, filled with magnificent, tall ships whose white canvas sails billow like clouds against the azure sky, their wooden hulls creaking gently as they sway with the tide. These were the vessels that would carry determined sailors across weeks and months of open ocean, through storms that could shatter masts like twigs, and calm doldrums that could strand a ship for endless days under the blazing sun. The crews who boarded these ships were hardy men who understood the countless dangers that awaited them beyond the horizon. Pirates lurking in hidden coves, treacherous reefs that could tear a hull apart, and navigation by the stars alone when clouds obscured the sky for days on end. Yet there was one enemy more deadly than all the pirates and storms combined, one that stalked silently through the lower decks and claimed more sailors' lives than any battle ever fought. This invisible killer was known as scurvy, a mysterious disease that would begin its cruel work just weeks into any long voyage. At first it seemed harmless enough. Sailors would notice their gums becoming tender and their teeth feeling loose in their mouths. But as the weeks turned to months at sea, the disease would tighten its grip with relentless determination. Their skin would grow pale and take on a sickly pallor, like parchment left too long in the sun. Wounds that should have healed quickly would refuse to close, bleeding at the slightest touch, and old scars that had long since faded would mysteriously reopen, as if the very life force was draining from their bodies. The sailors' joints would swell and throb with pain that made even the simplest tasks feel like monumental efforts, and their breath would grow short as their hearts struggled to pump blood through bodies that were slowly failing them. Most terrifying of all, their minds would begin to cloud with confusion and despair, as if the disease was stealing not just their physical strength, but their very spirit. Ship's surgeons of the time had no understanding of what caused this dreadful affliction, and they watched helplessly as strong men who could climb rigging in howling gales would waste away to mere shadows of themselves. The captains and ship's doctors tried everything they could imagine to combat this mysterious plague. They bled the sailors, believing that removing bad blood would restore their health, but this only weakened them further. They administered harsh purgatives and bitter tonics, thinking that cleansing the body would drive out the illness, but the men only grew weaker. Some believed it was caused by the stagnant air in the lower decks, so they opened every available hatch and porthole, yet still the disease spread. Others thought it was the result of eating too much salted meat and ship's biscuit, so they rationed these provisions, but the sailors continued to sicken and die. What these learned physicians and experienced sea captains did not yet understand was that the human body requires a constant supply of fresh nutrients to maintain its health and vitality. In particular, there is a substance we now know as vitamin C, found abundantly in fresh fruits and vegetables, that is absolutely essential for the body to properly heal wounds, maintain healthy blood vessels, and keep the immune system strong. Without this vital nutrient, the very foundations of health begin to crumble, starting with the smallest blood vessels and gradually affecting every system in the body. On land, people naturally consumed enough fresh foods to maintain their health without even thinking about it. They ate fresh apples and pears from their orchards, leafy greens from their gardens, and wild berries gathered from hedgerows and forest clearings. But at sea, space was precious, and provisions had to last for months without spoiling. The ship's stores were filled with barrels of salted pork and beef, sacks of hardtack biscuits that could survive any weather, wheels of aged cheese, and casks of rum and beer. All of these foods were chosen for their ability to remain edible during long voyages, but not one of them contained the life-giving nutrients that sailors' bodies desperately needed. The first whispers of a potential cure began to emerge from the most unlikely sources, not from the learned physicians in their grand universities, but from practical sailors who had observed strange patterns during their voyages. Some old salts noticed that crews who had stopped at tropical islands to take on fresh water often seemed healthier and stronger than those who had sailed directly across open ocean. Others remembered voyages where the ship's cook had managed to keep a few precious fruits from spoiling in the cool depths of the hold, and how the men who had shared these treats seemed to recover more quickly from minor injuries and illness. But it was not until the middle of the 16th century that these scattered observations began to coalesce into something resembling understanding. Dutch sailors, renowned for their extensive trade networks and practical approach to navigation, began to notice that certain fruits seemed to have almost miraculous healing properties when consumed by sailors suffering from scurvy. The most remarkable of these was the sweet orange, that brilliant globe of sunshine that grew in warm Mediterranean groves and distant tropical islands. When Dutch trading ships would put into port in Spain or Portugal, the sailors would eagerly trade their valuable cargo for fresh oranges, not as a luxury, but as a necessity for survival. They discovered that a sailor who was near death from scurvy could be restored to health within a matter of days by consuming fresh orange juice. The transformation was so dramatic that it seemed like magic. Men who could barely stand would be climbing the rigging with renewed vigor. Their wounds would begin to heal, and the color would return to their pallid cheeks. Word of this miraculous cure spread slowly through the maritime community, passed from captain to captain in hushed conversations in taverns and harborside inns. But knowledge and application were two very different things in an age when a single orange could cost more than a sailor's daily wage. These precious fruits had to be transported great distances from the groves where they grew often changing hands multiple times before reaching northern ports. Each merchant along the chain demanded his profit, and by the time oranges reached the ship's chandlers who supplied ocean-going vessels, their price had multiplied many times over. Consider for a moment the incredible journey that a single orange would take to reach a sailor's hands in those days. It would begin its life on a tree in a sunny grove, perhaps on the hillsides of southern Spain, where the Mediterranean climate provided the perfect balance of warm sunshine and gentle sea breezes. The orange would ripen slowly under the careful attention of grove keepers who had inherited their knowledge through generations of cultivation. When the fruit reached perfect ripeness, it would be carefully picked by hand and packed in wooden crates with straw to protect it during transport. From the grove, the oranges would travel by ox cart over rough mountain roads to a coastal trading port, where merchants would examine each crate for signs of damage or spoilage. Only the finest specimens would be selected for the long journey north, as any fruit showing the slightest blemish would not survive the weeks of transport ahead. The oranges would then be loaded aboard trading vessels for a voyage that could take weeks or even months, depending on wind and weather conditions. During this sea voyage, the oranges would be stored in the coolest, most protected part of the ship's hold, carefully monitored by crew members who understood that their cargo was worth its weight in gold. The fruits had to be protected from excessive heat, which would cause them to ripen too quickly and spoil, but also from extreme cold, which could damage their delicate flesh. The ship's movement in rough seas could bruise the oranges against each other, ruining entire crates, so they were often packed with additional padding and secured with ropes to prevent shifting during storms. Upon reaching northern ports like London, Amsterdam, or Hamburg, the surviving oranges would be sold to wholesale merchants who specialized in exotic goods. These merchants understood the value of fresh citrus fruits and would pay premium prices for high-quality specimens. The oranges would then be distributed to smaller retailers, ship's chandlers, and wealthy households, with the price increasing at each step of the distribution chain. By the time a ship's captain sought to purchase oranges for his crew, he would discover that a single fruit could cost as much as several days' wages for an ordinary sailor. For a ship carrying a crew of 50 men, purchasing enough oranges to prevent scurvy would require an investment that could easily exceed the value of the ship's other provisions combined. Many captains found themselves facing an impossible choice: spend a fortune on oranges and risk bankruptcy, or sail without them and almost certainly lose crew members to scurvy during the voyage. The economic calculations were brutal but inescapable. A ship's owner investing in a trading voyage had to carefully balance the costs of provisions against the potential profits from successful completion of the journey. Every pound spent on expensive oranges was a pound that could not be invested in trade goods that would generate revenue. Yet the loss of experienced crew members to scurvy could doom a voyage entirely, as there were rarely enough healthy sailors remaining to properly handle the ship in rough weather or emergency situations. This created a maritime hierarchy where only the most prosperous and far-sighted captains could afford to keep their crews healthy with fresh citrus fruits. These captains commanded the finest ships and attracted the most experienced sailors, who knew that signing aboard a vessel with a reputation for providing oranges greatly increased their chances of returning home alive and healthy. Meanwhile, less wealthy captains were forced to sail with skeleton crews and accept higher rates of mortality as an unfortunate cost of doing business. The psychological impact on sailors was profound and far-reaching. Men who had witnessed the slow, agonizing death of shipmates from scurvy understood exactly what an orange represented, not just a sweet treat, but the difference between life and death. When a sailor was fortunate enough to receive his ration of orange juice, he would savor every drop with the reverence of a man receiving communion. The bright, tangy flavor was not just pleasant. It was the taste of hope itself, the promise that he might live to see his family again. Stories began to spread through port towns of miraculous recoveries attributed to the healing power of oranges. There was the tale of the merchant vessel Pride of Bristol, whose crew had been decimated by scurvy during a voyage to the Caribbean islands. When the ship limped into Port Royal, with only 12 men still able to work, the local governor took pity and provided them with a supply of fresh oranges from his private plantation. Within a fortnight, sailors who had been unable to leave their hammocks were back on their feet, and the ship was able to complete its journey home with a full complement of healthy crew members. Another legend told of Captain Willem van der Berg, a Dutch trader who had invested his entire fortune in a cargo of precious spices from the East Indies. As his ship rounded the Cape of Good Hope, scurvy began to ravage his crew with such ferocity that he feared he would have to abandon his valuable cargo and make for the nearest port. In desperation, he traded half his spice cargo to a Portuguese merchant for 3 crates of fresh oranges. His fellow captains mocked him for what seemed like a foolish bargain, trading exotic spices worth a king's ransom for mere fruit. But Van der Berg's crew recovered completely, and he was able to complete his voyage and sell his remaining cargo for enough profit to purchase 3 new ships. The most poignant stories were those told by the sailors themselves, men who spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the moment they tasted fresh orange juice after weeks of battling scurvy. They described the sensation as if liquid sunshine was flowing through their veins, bringing warmth and vitality back to bodies that had been slowly surrendering to death. Some claimed they could feel their strength returning with each swallow, as if the orange juice was washing away the disease and replacing it with pure life force. These testimonials spread through the maritime community like ripples on a calm sea, carried by word of mouth from ship to ship, port to port. Sailors would gather in taverns and share their experiences, comparing notes on which varieties of oranges seemed most effective, how much juice was needed to cure advanced cases of scurvy, and which ports offered the best prices for fresh citrus. This informal network of knowledge sharing became more valuable than any official medical text, as it was based on practical experience rather than theoretical speculation. The impact on global trade routes was subtle but significant. Captains began to plan their voyages around the availability of fresh citrus fruits, sometimes taking longer routes that would allow them to stop at ports known for their orange markets. The Canary Islands, with their perfect climate for citrus cultivation, became essential waypoints for ships heading across the Atlantic. The Azores, those lonely volcanic islands in the middle of the ocean, became incredibly valuable strategic positions, not for their military importance, but for their ability to supply fresh fruit to passing vessels. Spanish and Portuguese merchants, recognizing the enormous demand for their citrus fruits, began to expand their orange groves and develop new techniques for preserving the fruits during long sea voyages. They experimented with different packing methods, using everything from sawdust to sand to keep the oranges fresh during transport. Some merchants developed primitive refrigeration techniques, using blocks of ice cut from mountain lakes and stored in specially insulated compartments aboard their ships. The most successful of these fruit merchants became extraordinarily wealthy, their fortunes built on the simple orange. They established networks of agents in ports throughout Europe who would send word when fresh supplies arrived and what prices were being demanded. These merchants lived in grand mansions overlooking the sea, their wealth displayed in fine furniture, elegant clothing, and elaborate gardens where orange trees grew in carefully tended rows as living symbols of their prosperity. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this trade was how it transformed the relationship between officers and common sailors aboard ship. In the traditional maritime hierarchy, captains and officers enjoyed far better food, private cabins, and numerous privileges that distinguished them from the ordinary crew. However, when it came to scurvy prevention, a ship's survival depended on keeping the entire crew healthy and able to work. A captain might enjoy the finest wines and delicacies from his private stores, but if his crew was too weak from scurvy to work the ship, his luxury provisions would do him no good at the bottom of the ocean. This practical reality led to a new understanding of shared vulnerability and mutual dependence. The wisest captains learned that investing in orange juice for their entire crew was not an act of charity, but a matter of enlightened self-interest. A healthy crew meant a ship that could weather storms, navigate treacherous waters, and defend itself against pirates. The cost of oranges, however high, was insignificant compared to the value of completing a voyage successfully. Some captains developed elaborate rationing systems to make their precious orange supplies last as long as possible. They would calculate exactly how much juice each man needed to prevent scurvy, measuring it out with scientific precision and recording consumption in detailed logs. Other captains took a different approach, believing that morale was as important as nutrition, and would occasionally declare special celebrations where the entire crew could enjoy fresh oranges together, creating moments of joy and fellowship that strengthened the bonds between shipmates. The preparation and distribution of orange juice became almost ritualistic aboard many ships. The ship's cook, often one of the most respected members of the crew, despite his humble station, would carefully extract the juice from each precious orange, straining out the pulp and seeds to maximize the amount of life-giving liquid. The juice would be served in small pewter cups, and sailors would gather on deck in the early morning light to receive their daily ration. These moments took on an almost sacred quality, as men who faced death every day from storms, disease, and enemy action took communion with the golden elixir that promised to keep them alive. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate health benefits. Sailors who knew their captain had invested in orange juice felt valued and cared for, which translated into greater loyalty and willingness to face danger. Crews on ships known for providing citrus rations developed reputations for reliability and courage, as the men were not weakened by disease and were confident in their captain's commitment to their welfare. This created a virtuous cycle where the best sailors sought positions on ships with generous orange provisions, which in turn made those vessels more successful and profitable. The contrast with ships that could not afford fresh citrus was stark and heartbreaking. Vessels that departed port with the same number of healthy crew members would return months later in vastly different conditions. Ships with adequate orange supplies would sail into harbor with their full complement of men, their sails properly trimmed and their decks bustling with activity. But ships that had economized on citrus would limp home with skeleton crews, their survivors gaunt and weakened, their once proud vessels showing signs of neglect that only understaffed ships exhibited. The families of sailors learned to judge their loved ones' chances of survival not by the size or reputation of the ship, but by the captain's willingness to invest in orange juice. Wives and mothers would visit the docks before departure, not to bid farewell, but to observe the loading of provisions. The sight of crates of oranges being carried aboard was cause for celebration and relief, while ships that departed without fresh citrus were viewed with dread and resignation. This created social pressure that extended throughout the maritime community. Captains who were known to skimp on orange juice found it increasingly difficult to recruit experienced crew members, as word spread through port towns about which ships were likely to bring their sailors home alive. Ship owners discovered that the seemingly high cost of citrus fruits was actually a sound business investment, as vessels with healthy crews completed more voyages, suffered less damage from understaffing, and attracted higher quality sailors who commanded better wages but delivered superior performance. The orange trade also created new opportunities for entrepreneurship and innovation. Ambitious merchants developed new preservation techniques, such as creating concentrated orange syrups that took up less storage space and lasted longer than fresh fruit. Others experimented with drying orange peels and creating powdered supplements that could be reconstituted with water when needed. Some of these early attempts at food preservation were remarkably sophisticated, involving complex processes of dehydration, fermentation, and chemical treatment that laid the groundwork for modern food science. The most successful innovations often came from unexpected sources. Ship's cooks, working with limited equipment and storage space, developed techniques for maximizing the nutritional value of their precious orange supplies. They learned to use every part of the fruit, creating teas from the peels, candying the rinds for long-term storage, and even fermenting orange juice into mildly alcoholic beverages that retained their anti-scurvy properties while providing additional calories and morale benefits. Some ships began carrying small orange trees and portable planters, hoping to maintain a supply of fresh fruit during long voyages. These floating gardens required constant care and attention, as the trees had to be protected from salt spray, secured against rough weather, and provided with fresh water that was itself a precious commodity at sea. While few of these experiments were entirely successful, they demonstrated the lengths to which sailors and captains were willing to go to secure a reliable source of vitamin C. The cultural impact of the orange's life-saving properties extended far beyond the maritime world. In port cities throughout Europe, oranges became symbols of hope, prosperity, and good fortune. Wealthy families would display fresh oranges in their homes during winter months, not just as decorations, but as tangible evidence of their prosperity and connection to global trade networks. The ability to afford fresh citrus during the cold months, when such fruits were most scarce and expensive, became a mark of social status comparable to owning fine jewelry or exotic spices. Artists and writers began to incorporate oranges into their work as symbols of life, health, and divine providence. Still life paintings frequently featured oranges alongside other precious objects, their bright color representing vitality and abundance. Poets wrote verses comparing the orange's golden hue to sunlight and its life-giving properties to divine grace. The fruit that had once been merely a pleasant treat became invested with deeper meaning, representing humanity's triumph over disease and death through knowledge and perseverance. The transformation of the orange from simple fruit to precious commodity had profound effects on international diplomacy and trade relationships. Nations that controlled citrus-growing regions found themselves wielding unexpected influence in maritime affairs. Spain and Portugal, with their extensive orange groves in favorable Mediterranean climates, discovered that their fruit exports were as strategically important as their gold and silver mines. Treaties between seafaring nations began to include provisions for citrus trade, and diplomatic disputes sometimes arose over access to orange-producing territories. The Dutch, masters of global commerce, established some of the first systematic approaches to citrus distribution. Their East India Company recognized that maintaining healthy crews was essential for profitable long-distance trading, so they created a network of supply stations throughout their maritime empire. From the Cape of Good Hope to the Spice Islands of Indonesia, Dutch merchants established relationships with local growers and developed standardized methods for purchasing, storing, and distributing citrus fruits to their ships. This gave Dutch vessels a significant advantage in long-distance trade, as their crews remained healthier and more effective than competitors who could not afford such comprehensive provisioning. The British Royal Navy, initially slower to adopt systematic citrus provisioning, eventually recognized the strategic importance of preventing scurvy in their fighting forces. Naval battles were often won or lost based on which fleet could maintain discipline and effectiveness during long campaigns, and crews weakened by scurvy were virtually useless in combat situations. The British began purchasing oranges in enormous quantities, creating government contracts with Spanish and Portuguese suppliers that rivaled the value of their arms purchases. These contracts were so lucrative that some Mediterranean merchants became wealthy enough to influence the politics of their home regions, using their orange revenues to fund local improvements and gain political power. Individual stories of survival and transformation continued to emerge from the maritime world, each adding to the growing legend of the orange's miraculous properties. There was the account of young Thomas Hartwell, a ship's apprentice who had signed aboard the merchant vessel Prosperity for his first ocean voyage. 3 months into their Atlantic crossing, scurvy began to claim crew members with frightening regularity. Thomas watched in horror as strong men who had seemed invincible gradually weakened and died, their bodies unable to heal the smallest cuts or bruises. When Thomas himself began to show symptoms, his gums bleeding and his old wounds reopening, he was certain he would never see his home port again. But the Prosperity carried a captain who understood the value of citrus fruits, and when they reached a small Portuguese island to take on fresh water, he traded a portion of their valuable cargo for several crates of fresh oranges. Thomas received his first taste of orange juice when he was so weak he could barely lift his head from his hammock. He later described the experience as being touched by divine grace, feeling strength and vitality flowing back into his body with each swallow. Within days he was back on his feet, and within 2 weeks he was climbing the rigging with renewed vigor. Thomas completed that voyage and many others, eventually becoming a captain himself, and he never sailed without adequate citrus provisions for his crew. The story of Captain Isabella Rodriguez became legendary throughout the Spanish maritime community. She was one of the few women to command her own trading vessel, having inherited her father's ship and cargo business after his death. Many of her male competitors expected her to fail, believing that a woman could not command the respect and loyalty necessary to lead a crew through dangerous ocean voyages. But Captain Rodriguez understood better than most the importance of crew welfare, and she made orange juice a cornerstone of her leadership philosophy. Her ship, the Santa Maria delle Esperanza, became known throughout Caribbean and Mediterranean ports for the exceptional health and morale of its crew. Rodriguez personally supervised the purchase and distribution of citrus fruits, often spending hours in local markets examining oranges for quality and negotiating with growers for the best prices. She developed an extensive network of suppliers who respected her knowledge and fair dealing, ensuring that her ship always had access to fresh fruit regardless of market conditions. Her success in keeping crews healthy earned her a reputation that attracted the best sailors, and her voyages became so profitable that she eventually owned a small fleet of vessels, each provisioned with her signature orange supplies. The economic ripple effects of the citrus trade extended far beyond individual ships and crews. Entire regions began to restructure their agriculture to meet the growing demand for oranges. Farmers in Spain, Portugal, Italy, and southern France expanded their citrus groves, often abandoning other crops to focus on the more profitable orange trees. This agricultural shift created new patterns of land ownership and rural development, as successful orange growers accumulated wealth and social status that had previously been reserved for grain farmers and livestock owners. The development of orange cultivation also spurred innovations in agricultural techniques. Growers experimented with different varieties of orange trees, seeking to develop fruits that would have longer shelf life, better flavor, or higher vitamin content. They developed new methods of pruning, fertilizing, and pest control that increased yields and improved fruit quality. Some of the most successful growers became early agricultural scientists, keeping detailed records of their experiments and sharing their knowledge with other farmers, creating communities of practice that advanced the science of citrus cultivation. The seasonal nature of orange production created complex market dynamics that required sophisticated understanding of supply and demand. Oranges typically ripened during winter months in Mediterranean climates, which meant that fresh supplies were most abundant just when northern European ports were experiencing their harshest weather, and when sailors were most desperate for vitamin C after months at sea. This created intense competition among ships' captains for limited supplies, driving prices to extraordinary heights during peak demand periods. Merchants who understood these seasonal patterns could make enormous profits by purchasing oranges during harvest season and storing them in specially designed warehouses until prices peaked. These storage facilities became architectural marvels in their own right, featuring innovative ventilation systems, temperature control mechanisms, and pest prevention measures that allowed oranges to remain fresh for extended periods. The most successful fruit merchants invested heavily in these storage technologies, understanding that the ability to supply fresh oranges during off-season periods was the key to maximum profitability. The social implications of the orange trade created new forms of inequality and social stratification within maritime communities. Ships that could afford adequate citrus provisions attracted the most experienced and capable sailors, creating an elite class of mariners who could command higher wages and better working conditions. These privileged sailors developed their own culture and traditions, often marked by better health, longer careers, and greater accumulation of wealth than their less fortunate counterparts who served on ships without citrus provisions. Meanwhile, sailors who could not secure positions on well-provisioned vessels faced shortened careers and reduced earning potential due to the health problems associated with scurvy. This created a vicious cycle where the poorest sailors, who most needed steady employment, were forced to accept positions on ships where they were most likely to suffer from disease and disability. The resulting health disparities reinforced existing social hierarchies and made it difficult for sailors from humble backgrounds to advance in their careers. The psychological effects of this inequality were profound and lasting. Sailors developed an almost superstitious reverence for oranges, viewing them not just as food, but as talismans of protection against the dangers of sea life. Men who had survived voyages with adequate citrus supplies often carried dried orange peels with them as good luck charms, believing that the mere presence of citrus would ward off disease. These beliefs, while scientifically unfounded, reflected the deep psychological impact that the orange trade had on maritime culture. The ritual aspects of orange consumption aboard ship became increasingly elaborate and meaningful. Some captains instituted formal ceremonies for the distribution of orange juice, treating it as a sacrament that bound the crew together in their shared struggle against the sea. These ceremonies often took place at sunset, when the golden color of the orange juice seemed to echo the dying light of the sun, creating moments of beauty and solemnity that helped sailors cope with the harsh realities of their profession. The impact on family life in maritime communities was equally significant. Wives and children of sailors learned to judge the prospects for their loved ones' safe return partly by observing the citrus provisions being loaded aboard their ships. Women would sometimes pool their resources to purchase oranges for sailors' families to give to their men before departure, believing that this gesture would provide protection during the voyage. These community efforts created bonds of mutual support that helped maritime families cope with the uncertainties and dangers of sea life. The medical understanding of scurvy's relationship to citrus consumption gradually evolved from empirical observation to more systematic knowledge. Ship's surgeons and physicians began keeping detailed records of scurvy cases, documenting which treatments proved effective and which failed. These medical records, accumulated over decades of voyages, provided the foundation for the first scientific understanding of nutritional diseases. While the concept of vitamins would not be discovered for several more centuries, maritime medicine was developing practical knowledge about the relationship between diet and health that would eventually contribute to modern nutritional science. Some of the most dedicated medical practitioners of the era were ship's surgeons, who made it their mission to understand and combat scurvy. These men, working with limited resources and primitive equipment, conducted what amounted to controlled experiments in nutrition, carefully documenting the effects of different dietary interventions on their patients. Their observations, recorded in ship's logs and medical journals, provided invaluable data about the progression of scurvy and the effectiveness of various treatments. The legacy of these early medical pioneers extended far beyond their immediate contributions to maritime health. Their systematic approach to observation and documentation established principles of medical research that would influence the development of scientific medicine. The detailed records they kept of scurvy cases, including careful descriptions of symptoms, treatment protocols, and outcomes, provided a foundation of empirical evidence that later researchers would use to develop more comprehensive theories of nutrition and disease. The cultural transformation of the orange from common fruit to precious commodity influenced art, literature, and popular culture throughout the maritime world. Painters began to include oranges in their portraits of wealthy merchants and ship owners, using the bright fruit as a symbol of prosperity and worldly success. The orange became a visual shorthand for international trade, exotic luxury, and the mastery of distant seas. In some portraits, the subject would be shown holding a single orange, the fruit's golden surface gleaming like a jewel against rich fabrics and expensive furnishings. Writers and poets of the era found in the orange a powerful metaphor for hope, healing, and the triumph of human ingenuity over natural adversity. Epic poems about sea voyages would often include passages describing the joy of sailors receiving their orange rations, comparing the fruit's golden color to sunshine breaking through storm clouds and its healing properties to divine intervention. These literary works helped spread awareness of the orange's importance beyond maritime circles, making the general public more aware of the challenges faced by sailors and the solutions that human knowledge and commerce had provided. The religious implications of the orange's life-saving properties were not lost on the devoutly Christian societies of the era. Many sailors and their families interpreted the discovery of citrus as a cure for scurvy as evidence of divine providence, believing that God had provided this natural remedy for those who ventured onto the dangerous seas in pursuit of honest trade. Churches in port cities began incorporating oranges into their seasonal decorations and religious ceremonies, and some priests would bless orange supplies before ships departed on long voyages. This religious dimension added another layer of meaning to the orange trade, as merchants and sailors began to view their work not just as commercial enterprise, but as participation in a divine plan for human exploration and discovery. The idea that God had placed healing fruits in distant lands to sustain those who would spread Christianity and civilization to new territories became a powerful justification for the risks and costs associated with maritime exploration. This religious framework helped legitimize the enormous expense of citrus provisioning by casting it as a moral and spiritual necessity rather than merely a commercial calculation. The technological innovations spurred by the need to preserve and transport oranges had far-reaching consequences for the development of global trade networks. Merchants and ship builders developed new techniques for constructing specialized storage compartments that could maintain optimal temperature and humidity for citrus preservation. These innovations in cargo handling and preservation were later applied to other perishable goods, improving the efficiency of international trade in everything from dairy products to fresh vegetables. The development of improved preservation techniques also led to experiments with other methods of preventing scurvy. Some merchants began producing concentrated orange extracts, reducing large quantities of fresh juice into smaller, more portable forms that retained their anti-scurvy properties. Others experimented with fermented orange products, creating alcoholic beverages that provided both nutritional benefits and the morale-boosting effects of alcohol. These early ventures into food processing and preservation represented the beginning of what would eventually become the modern food industry. The competitive advantages gained by nations and trading companies that mastered citrus distribution became increasingly apparent as maritime commerce expanded. Dutch, Portuguese, and Spanish merchants who had established reliable sources of oranges could undertake longer and more ambitious voyages than their competitors, opening new trade routes and establishing commercial relationships in distant territories. This gave them significant advantages in the competition for global markets, as they could maintain healthy crews in regions where other nations' sailors succumbed to disease. The British East India Company, recognizing the strategic importance of scurvy prevention, eventually established some of the most sophisticated citrus supply chains in maritime history. They created detailed contracts with growers throughout the Mediterranean and established storage and distribution facilities at key ports along their trade routes. Company ships carried standardized medical supplies, including measured quantities of orange juice, and company physicians developed protocols for preventing and treating scurvy that became models for other maritime organizations. The social dynamics within individual ships began to evolve as the importance of citrus became better understood. Captains who had previously ruled their vessels through fear and harsh discipline discovered that investing in crew welfare, particularly through adequate nutrition, produced better results than traditional authoritarian methods. Sailors who felt valued and cared for by their officers were more likely to perform their duties effectively and remain loyal during difficult circumstances. This shift toward more enlightened leadership styles had profound implications for maritime culture. The traditional image of the tyrannical sea captain, ruling through violence and intimidation, began to give way to a new model of leadership based on competence, foresight, and genuine concern for crew welfare. Captains who understood the importance of nutrition, medical care, and fair treatment attracted better crews and achieved greater success than those who relied solely on traditional disciplinary methods. The economic calculations surrounding orange purchases became increasingly sophisticated as merchants and captains gained experience with citrus provisioning. They developed detailed formulas for calculating optimal quantities based on crew size, voyage duration, and expected ports of call. Some of the more successful captains kept detailed records of their citrus expenses and the health outcomes of their crews, creating databases of information that helped them optimize their provisioning strategies for future voyages. These records also provided valuable information for marine insurance companies, which began to adjust their policies based on ships' citrus provisioning practices. Vessels that carried adequate orange supplies were considered lower risks and could obtain insurance at better rates than ships that economized on crew nutrition. This created additional financial incentives for proper citrus provisioning, as the savings in insurance premiums often offset a significant portion of the fruit's cost. The development of insurance policies specifically related to crew health and nutrition represented an important evolution in maritime commerce. Insurance companies began to require detailed inventories of ships' medical supplies, including citrus provisions, before issuing policies. They also started employing medical experts who could evaluate the adequacy of different provisioning strategies, creating some of the first systematic approaches to occupational health and safety in the maritime industry. The psychological impact of orange rationing on crew morale became an important factor in voyage planning and management. Experienced captains learned that the distribution of orange juice could be used strategically to maintain morale during difficult periods of a voyage. A special ration of fresh orange during a storm or after a particularly challenging stretch of sailing could lift spirits and reinforce the crew's confidence in their officers' care and competence. Some captains developed elaborate reward systems based on orange distribution, using extra citrus rations as incentives for exceptional performance or good behavior. This created positive associations between oranges and achievement, reinforcing the fruit's value as both medicine and morale booster. Sailors would compete for the privilege of receiving additional orange juice, and this competition could be channeled into improved performance of their duties. The timing of orange distribution also became an important consideration in voyage management. Some captains preferred to distribute citrus rations in the morning, believing that the vitamin C would provide energy and health benefits throughout the working day. Others chose evening distribution, creating a daily ritual that helped mark the passage of time and provided something for the crew to look forward to during long, monotonous stretches at sea. The preparation and serving of orange juice became an art form aboard many ships, with cooks developing signature techniques for extracting maximum nutrition and flavor from their precious citrus supplies. Some cooks would add small amounts of honey or other sweeteners to improve the juice's palatability, while others experimented with combining orange juice with other ingredients to create nutritious beverages that provided additional health benefits. The social hierarchy surrounding orange distribution reflected broader patterns of inequality and privilege within maritime society. Officers typically received larger and more frequent citrus rations than ordinary sailors, and the quality of oranges available to different ranks often varied significantly. However, the universal nature of scurvy meant that even these hierarchical distinctions had to be balanced against the practical need to keep the entire crew healthy enough to operate the ship effectively. The cultural rituals that developed around orange consumption reflected the deep meaning that this simple fruit had acquired in maritime society. Some crews developed traditional songs or chants that accompanied the distribution of citrus rations, creating moments of fellowship and shared purpose that helped bind the men together during their dangerous voyages. These rituals served important psychological functions, providing structure and meaning during the long, uncertain months at sea. The legacy of the orange trade's impact on maritime culture can be seen in the evolution of naval traditions and customs that persist to this day. The British Royal Navy's traditional lime juice rations, which earned British sailors the nickname limeys, were a direct descendant of the earlier orange provisioning practices. Many of the protocols for medical care and nutrition aboard modern naval vessels can be traced back to the hard-won knowledge gained during the age of sail, when a simple orange could mean the difference between life and death for sailors venturing into the unknown reaches of the world's oceans. The transformation of global trade patterns due to the orange's medicinal properties created lasting changes in how nations approached maritime exploration and colonization. Countries that had previously focused solely on acquiring gold, silver, and exotic spices began to recognize the strategic value of territories that could produce life-saving citrus fruits. Islands and coastal regions with favorable climates for orange cultivation became coveted prizes in the ongoing competition between European powers for global dominance. The Portuguese, who had established some of the earliest systematic approaches to citrus cultivation in their Atlantic island colonies, found themselves wielding unexpected influence in international maritime affairs. The Azores and Madeira, previously valued mainly as strategic waypoints for navigation, became essential supply stations where ships could obtain the oranges necessary for long ocean crossings. The Portuguese leveraged this advantage skillfully, using their control of citrus supplies to negotiate favorable trade agreements and strategic alliances with other maritime powers. Spanish colonial administrators in the Caribbean and South America began to encourage citrus cultivation not just for local consumption, but as a valuable export commodity that could be traded to passing ships of all nationalities. This created new sources of revenue for colonial settlements and provided additional justification for territorial expansion into regions with suitable climates for orange production. The economic importance of citrus cultivation influenced settlement patterns, with colonists establishing communities in locations that might otherwise have been considered marginal for their agricultural potential, but proved ideal for growing the fruits that sailors desperately needed. The Dutch, with their characteristic innovation and commercial acumen, developed some of the most sophisticated approaches to citrus distribution and preservation. They established networks of contracted growers throughout their colonial empire, creating standardized quality requirements and pricing structures that ensured reliable supplies for their extensive merchant fleet. Dutch ships became known for carrying some of the finest and most carefully preserved oranges available, giving their crews significant advantages in health and morale during long voyages. The scientific understanding of scurvy and its relationship to diet continued to evolve throughout this period, driven by the practical observations of ship's surgeons and experienced sea captains. While the precise mechanism of vitamin C's role in preventing scurvy would not be understood for several more centuries, maritime medical practitioners were developing increasingly sophisticated knowledge about the disease's progression, treatment, and prevention. They observed that certain varieties of oranges seemed more effective than others, that the freshness of the fruit directly correlated with its healing properties, and that consistent consumption was more beneficial than sporadic large doses. These observations led to the development of the first systematic protocols for scurvy prevention in maritime medicine. Ship's surgeons began keeping detailed records of citrus consumption and health outcomes, creating databases of information that allowed them to refine their treatment methods and improve their success rates. Some of the most dedicated medical practitioners published their findings in scholarly journals, contributing to the broader understanding of nutritional diseases and their treatment. The individual human stories that emerge from this era of maritime medicine provide profound insights into the personal impact of the orange trade. There was the account of Margaret Sullivan, the wife of a ship's captain, who spent her life savings to purchase extra oranges for her husband's crew before their departure on a particularly dangerous voyage to the Arctic regions. When the ship returned 2 years later with all hands healthy and alive, the crew credited their survival to Margaret's generosity, and she became a legendary figure in their home port, known as the woman whose oranges had saved 30 lives. Another touching story involved young Peter Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who had joined the merchant crew to earn passage to the New World. When scurvy struck the ship during their Atlantic crossing, Peter was among the most severely affected, his body racked with pain and his spirit nearly broken by the prospect of dying so far from his family. The ship's captain, moved by the young man's plight, shared his personal orange rations with Peter, nursing him back to health with careful doses of citrus juice. Peter survived the voyage and eventually became a successful merchant himself, never forgetting the kindness that had saved his life. He established a tradition of providing free orange juice to poor sailors in the port where he conducted his business, creating a legacy of compassion that continued for generations. The cultural impact of these individual stories of survival and generosity helped transform public attitudes toward maritime professions and the men who pursued them. Sailors who had previously been viewed by many landlubbers as rough, uneducated men engaged in dangerous and morally questionable activities began to be seen as brave explorers who risked their lives to bring prosperity and knowledge to their communities. The Orange's role in their survival became part of a broader narrative about human ingenuity, compassion, and the triumph of knowledge over ignorance. This shift in public perception had practical consequences for maritime communities, as it became easier to recruit quality crew members and obtain community support for maritime enterprises. Families became more willing to allow their sons to pursue careers at sea, knowing that improvements in medical knowledge and nutrition had made such careers significantly safer than in previous generations. This influx of better educated and more motivated sailors contributed to improvements in maritime skills and safety that benefited the entire industry. The economic ripple effects of the orange trade continued to expand as the industry matured and became more sophisticated. Specialized merchants developed new techniques for grading oranges by quality, creating premium markets for the finest specimens and more affordable options for ships with limited budgets. This market segmentation allowed more captains to provide some citrus protection for their crews, even if they could not afford the highest quality fruit that commanded premium prices. The development of orange processing industries in major ports created new employment opportunities and economic growth in maritime communities. Workers were needed to sort, pack, and process citrus fruits, while specialized craftsmen developed better containers, preservation techniques, and distribution methods. These industries attracted investment and innovation, contributing to the overall economic vitality of port cities and creating networks of interdependent businesses that supported the maritime trade. The seasonal nature of citrus production led to the development of sophisticated storage and preservation technologies that would later be applied to other industries. Merchants invested in specialized warehouses with innovative ventilation systems, temperature control mechanisms, and pest prevention measures that allowed oranges to remain fresh for extended periods. These facilities became models for food storage and preservation that influenced the development of modern food distribution systems. The global network of citrus suppliers and distributors that emerged during this period represented one of the first truly international commodity markets, with standardized pricing, quality measures, and distribution channels that spanned continents. This market infrastructure provided a foundation for other international trade networks and demonstrated the potential for coordinated global commerce and specialized products. As our gentle journey through this remarkable chapter of maritime history draws to a close, we can see how a simple orange became far more than just a piece of fruit. It became a symbol of hope in the darkest moments at sea, a bridge between life and death for countless sailors, and a catalyst for innovations in medicine, agriculture, commerce, and human compassion that would resonate through the centuries. The legacy of those brave sailors and wise captains who recognized the value of the humble orange extends far beyond their own time. Their observations and experiences laid the groundwork for our modern understanding of nutrition and preventive medicine. Their willingness to invest in the health and welfare of their crews established principles of leadership and human care that continue to influence how we think about responsibility and community in challenging circumstances. Tonight, as you rest in the comfort and safety of your warm bed, surrounded by the abundance and security that our modern world provides, take a moment to appreciate the remarkable journey that brought us from those uncertain days when a single orange could mean the difference between life and death. Feel gratitude for the countless unknown sailors who faced the vast unknown oceans with courage, for the captains who chose compassion over profit, and for the merchants and growers who created the networks of care that sustained human exploration and discovery. Let the gentle rhythm of imagined ocean waves carry you toward peaceful sleep, knowing that you are part of an unbroken chain of human experience that stretches back through centuries of adventure, discovery, and the simple acts of kindness that have always made survival possible. Rest well, knowing that tomorrow brings its own opportunities for wisdom, compassion, and the small choices that can make extraordinary differences in the lives of others. Sleep peacefully, cradled by the knowledge that even the simplest gifts of nature, when approached with understanding and shared with generosity, have the power to sustain hope and preserve life across the vastest distances and through the longest, darkest nights at sea.